Iran is threatening to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Every red dot you see here is an oil tanker. And all of this is a single day's worth of traffic. Despite being just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, more than a fifth of the entire world's oil supply flows through it every day. That's about 17 billion barrels of oil per day, as well as billions of cubic feet of liquefied natural gas. Needless to say, the Strait of Hormuz is the single most vital oil artery in the entire known universe. And if Iran shuts it down, World War III is practically guaranteed.
The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow stretch of water that, if significantly disturbed, could throw the global oil market into a tailspin.
With Iran repeatedly threatening its closure over the years. But any blockade of the trade route would spell significant consequences for Iran.
Any disruption here would plunge global energy markets into absolute chaos. This is precisely why the US Department of Energy has labeled Hormuz as the world's most important oil transit choke point. Without the strait, there's simply no practical alternative route for Gulf oil exports to reach international markets. Closing the Hormuz would therefore trigger an immediate global crisis, instantly igniting fury from all major global powers. Countries like the United States, China, Russia, the Gulf states, the EU, India, and Japan, all of whom heavily depend on the Strait of Hormuz for their energy supplies. Finger-pointing and blame would rapidly escalate tensions into a full-blown international crisis. Within hours, global oil prices would skyrocket. Analysts predict crude oil prices could easily double or even triple. In fact, just the recent attack on Iran has already sent crude oil prices soaring by 15% this past week. And that's without even closing the strait. If Hormuz actually closes, the consequences for everyday people like you and me would be severe. Transportation costs would immediately rise, making daily commutes and shipping far more expensive. Electricity prices would skyrocket, making it much harder to power homes and businesses. And most importantly, higher fuel costs would directly spike prices for food, medicine, and all the basic items that we need to survive. With many countries' economies already fragile and barely holding on, a crisis of this magnitude could become the financial death sentence that they cannot afford. This is exactly why, for decades, global powers have kept a constant strategic presence in the Persian Gulf. The United States, in particular, has effectively staked its international credibility on this responsibility since the late 20th century, by stationing the powerful US Fifth Fleet in Bahrain to ensure Hormuz remains open and secure at all costs. Now, this is definitely a controversial topic. YouTube is not a fan of controversial topics because they are not advertiser-friendly. So, if you can please hit that like and subscribe button down below, it helps us out in the YouTube algorithm. We appreciate you. Iran fully understands the immense strategic leverage it holds over the world through the Strait of Hormuz. Historically, whenever Tehran has faced harsh sanctions or heavy international pressure, Iranian leaders have publicly warned that if they can't export their own oil, they'll make sure no one else can either, by blocking this vital waterway. But now, Israel has done precisely what Iran has always said would trigger such an extreme response. Not only did Israel carry out massive airstrikes, eliminating high-ranking Iranian generals and nuclear scientists, but it also hit Iran exactly where it hurts the most, its energy infrastructure. Israeli missiles struck a major fuel depot north of Tehran, ignited enormous fires at critical Iranian oil refineries at Shahran and Shareh, and even hit Iran's prized South Pars gas field, one of the largest natural gas production facilities in the world. Tehran is naturally furious, and given the severe blows it has endured, it may soon feel it has little choice but to finally follow through on its long-standing threats. In that case, the first countries to feel the full impact would be in Asia. In recent years, approximately 76% of all oil passing through Hormuz has been destined for Asian markets. Specifically, China, India, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore alone account for nearly 2/3 of all the oil transported through the strait. China, the world's largest oil importer, relies massively on Persian Gulf oil to fuel its economy. In early 2022, more than half of China's crude oil imports came directly from the Gulf region. Similarly, Japan and South Korea, both heavily industrialized economies, source 70 to 80% of their crude imports from the Middle East, virtually all passing via Hormuz. India, another huge consumer, imports approximately 5 million barrels per day, nearly 2/3 of which comes from the Gulf countries like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE, all again routed through the Strait of Hormuz. Then there's the West. Europe imports substantial amounts of oil and liquefied natural gas from Gulf producers. For instance, Qatar alone provides over 20% of Europe's LNG supply, all of which must pass through the Strait. Major European economies such as Germany, France, and Italy would face sudden energy shortages and spiraling costs, exacerbating economic struggles they are already grappling with due to inflation and supply disruptions. Even the United States, which is far more energy independent than many nations, would not be immune to the chaos. While America does produce much of its own oil, a global crisis of this magnitude would immediately send prices soaring. American drivers would quickly feel the pain at gas pumps, businesses would struggle as shipping and transportation costs surge, and ultimately, ordinary Americans would face higher prices for everything. But perhaps the worst and the last to suffer would be smaller, economically vulnerable nations, especially those already on the brink of collapse. Countries such as Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Lebanon, Egypt, and numerous smaller African countries. Sri Lanka, for instance, is already facing catastrophic debt and economic collapse, and imports roughly 100% of its fuel supplies. Lebanon, struggling with hyperinflation and severe economic collapse, imports nearly all of its fuel from Gulf producers. And to be clear, no other oil producer, not the massive shale fields in the United States, nor Russia's vast oil reserves, can suddenly pump enough extra barrels to replace the roughly 20 million barrels per day lost from the closed Strait of Hormuz. Even combined, alternative sources simply cannot bridge such a massive shortfall quickly or easily. This is precisely why a Hormuz crisis demands the attention, and possibly the intervention, of literally every major power. Energy is the lifeblood of modern civilization, and Hormuz is the artery carrying it. Iran knows this. The US knows this too. So does China, Europe, and just about everyone in between. In fact, the importance of the Strait of Hormuz became brutally clear during the devastating Iran-Iraq War during the 1980s. As both nations struggled to gain ground on land, their conflict inevitably spilled into the waters of the Persian Gulf. Initially, both sides targeted each other's oil exports to cripple their enemy's economy. But soon enough, commercial vessels, regardless of their nationality or neutrality, became easy targets, thus starting the tanker war.
Iran's neighbors in the Middle East are reacting to the tankers' attacks in different ways. Charlie D'Agata is in the United Arab Emirates with the regional response.
The United States is trying to ramp up international support, but the case against Iran is not a slam dunk here.
On one side, Iraqi fighter jets armed with French-made Exocet missiles relentlessly hunted loaded supertankers. Steel holes were punctured in mere seconds, turning multi-million-dollar ships into raging infernos in seconds. On the other side, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, then still new and fiercely determined, used speedboats loaded with naval mines, rocket-propelled grenades, and missiles to terrorize passing ships. They littered the Gulf's waters with hundreds of floating mines, each powerful enough to tear massive holes through hulls and ignite their flammable cargo of crude oil. A single successful attack could set an oil tanker ablaze for days. Crews faced flames hundreds of feet high, but most often, they ended up losing their lives in the horrific process. Civilian sailors from countries thousands of miles away found themselves trapped in an unimaginable nightmare. These horrific attacks kept happening relentlessly for months and even years. By the time international powers finally intervened, more than 400,000 merchant vessels had been struck, leaving at least 250 sailors dead and hundreds more gravely injured or severely burned. The Gulf itself turned dark, polluted by over 600,000 tons of spilled crude oil. Fires burning so fiercely that thick columns of smoke were clearly visible from space. But despite these dangers, despite knowing full well the life-threatening risks, the world still desperately needed the Persian Gulf oil. So, ships had no choice but to keep sailing directly into harm's way, hoping to make it out alive. The major mistake Iraq made was on May 17, 1987. When an Iraqi fighter jet mistakenly fired 2 Exocet missiles into the side of the USS Stark, a US Navy frigate stationed in the Gulf. 37 sailors lost their lives and wounded dozens more. At this point, the United States decided that enough was enough and launched Operation Earnest Will. Kuwaiti tankers were reflagged as American and provided naval escorts, making it the largest convoy operation since World War II. But guess what? The exact day Operation Earnest Will began, on July 24, 1987, the Kuwaiti supertanker Bridgerton, reflagged as American for protection, was struck by an Iranian naval mine. In response, the US immediately expanded and intensified its naval presence in the Persian Gulf. warships deployed specialized mine countermeasure units, and military planners began actively preparing for direct military confrontation with Iran. Then again, on April 14, 1988, the U.S. Army Navy frigate USS Admiral B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine, causing severe damage and injuries. This time, the United States retaliated with a decisive military strike, Operation Praying Mantis, launched on the 18th of April. U.S. forces sank or disabled several Iranian warships, destroyed offshore oil platforms, and severely weakened Iran's naval capabilities, making Operation Praying Mantis the largest U.S. naval surface combat since World War II. Tehran learned a brutal lesson that day. Completely closing the Strait of Hormuz would be a suicidal decision. But it also recognized the immense power it held, enough leverage to potentially cripple world economies, but at the cost of losing their own country in retaliation. This understanding kept them from ever fully blocking the Strait during the 1980s war, despite the extreme provocation. But today, after Israel's preemptive strikes, after seeing dozens of senior military commanders assassinated, key nuclear scientists killed, and critical nuclear facilities destroyed, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, finds himself cornered like never before. And if the supreme leader genuinely believes that he might be the next target on Israel's list, then he may feel pushed to a point of desperation, where delivering a catastrophic final blow seems his only remaining option, even if it means dragging the region, and potentially the entire world, down with him. Since 1988, the Ayatollah has only used threats of closing the Strait of Hormuz as leverage whenever Iran's tensions with the West intensified. Yet, every time, Khamenei and Iran stopped short of carrying out their threats. These repeated threats prompted the United States to rethink its entire strategy. In 2002, the US conducted a now famous military exercise called Millennium Challenge 2002. This massive war game simulated a conflict scenario in the Persian Gulf, pitting the US naval forces, the blue team, against an Iranian-style enemy, the red team. What happened next shocked American military planners. The red team, using a swarm of small, fast attack boats, missiles, and asymmetric warfare tactics, launched a devastating surprise attack on the simulated US naval convoy. In mere minutes, 16 American warships, including an aircraft carrier, were sunk in the simulation. The American general who led the red team later revealed that the sheer number of simulation threats completely overwhelmed the blue team's defensive systems. This shocking outcome prompted the US Navy to adjust tactics and take the Iranian small boat threat much more seriously. And since then, Iran has only improved its capabilities. The IRGC has steadily stockpiled advanced naval mines, fleets of agile speedboats, and mini submarines. Just a decade after the Millennium Challenge wargame in 2011 to 2012, the world saw a real-time demonstration of Iran's determination. When Iran's nuclear program triggered severe sanctions from the West, including a full oil embargo by the EU, Iran's vice president explicitly warned that if Iran couldn't export its oil, nobody else in the Gulf would either. Iranian forces conducted dramatic missile tests and naval drills specifically designed to show how they could indeed close the strait and destroy ships if needed. In response, the United States and its Western allies quickly dispatched additional warships and aircraft carriers to the region, warning Tehran that closing Hormuz would cross a red line. Despite these simulated results a decade earlier, and Iran's intense preparations, the Strait of Hormuz remained open. Iran ultimately backed down from following through, avoiding a direct military clash that could spiral out of control. But the crisis wasn't over yet. In 2018, tensions flared again after President Donald Trump withdrew the US from the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed crippling sanctions. Iranian leaders, including President Hassan Rouhani and senior military officials, renewed the same old threats. And sure enough, tensions escalated further in 2019. In May and June, 6 oil tankers were attacked near the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman, likely by limpet mines. The US blamed Iran's Revolutionary Guard for these sabotage operations and released a video of what it said were Iranians removing an unexploded mine from a ship's hull. Iran denied involvement, but the pattern of targeting Gulf shipping under the cover of deniability seemed to be Iran's good old tactic. Just weeks later, in June of 2019, the tensions spiked again, this time even higher. Iran shot down an advanced US surveillance drone near the Strait of Hormuz, claiming it had violated Iranian airspace. Furious, President Trump approved immediate retaliatory airstrikes targeting key Iranian military sites. But at the very last second, he called them off, narrowly avoiding an all-out war. Then again, just a few months later, in September of 2019, Yemen's Houthi rebels launched a devastating missile and drone attack on Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq facility, the biggest oil processing plant on Earth. In just a few hours, the attack took half of Saudi Arabia's oil production offline, about 5% of the world's total supply. It was the largest single disruption in global oil supplies since the 1991 Gulf War, and global oil prices spiked nearly 200% overnight. Saudi Arabia scrambled to repair the extensive damage, taking weeks to fully restore production. While the Houthis quickly claimed responsibility, US and Saudi intelligence strongly suspected that Iran itself had directly orchestrated the assault, supplying crucial support, training, and hardware. The US deployed additional troops, missile defense systems such as Patriot batteries, and fighter jets to Saudi Arabia. Additional naval assets were dispatched to reinforce the US Navy's Fifth Fleet stationed in Bahrain. Throughout late 2019 and into early 2020, the risk of direct conflict remained high. While an immediate war was narrowly avoided, just 4 years later, Iran had a new reason to stir up trouble in the region. After the October 7th attacks in 2023, Israel retaliated hard against Gaza, and that quickly brought Iran's proxies into the picture. Yemen's Houthi rebels wasted no time showing their solidarity, launching multiple strikes on commercial ships near the Bab el-Mandab Strait, the critical choke point in the Red Sea's southern entrance. Several vessels were damaged by missile strikes and drones, and in one particular incident, the Houthis even seized a UAE-flagged cargo ship, holding it briefly before letting it go under diplomatic pressure. These attacks forced ships to reconsider rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, a longer, expensive, and complicated detour that showed how alternative routes are painful but possible for Red Sea traffic. But for the Persian Gulf exports, there were no such alternatives. Ships must pass through Hormuz to reach the Indian Ocean. Sure, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have invested in pipelines that partially bypass Hormuz by carrying oil to ports on the Red Sea and the Gulf of Oman. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline to the Red Sea can handle about 5 million barrels per day, with surge capacity up to 7 million, and the UAE's pipeline manages about 1.5 million barrels per day. These pipelines combined barely cover 20 to 30% of what Hormuz normally handles each day. Moreover, these pipelines can be attacked by Iran's proxies. So, yeah, Hormuz is the crown jewel of leverage due to its lack of redundancy. And this brings us to the core message of this video, that any real threat or attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz will inevitably and immediately draw the powerful naval forces of the United States and the United Kingdom. From Israel's perspective, the preemptive strikes were a bid to set back Iran's nuclear capabilities and deter its regional aggression. But from the viewpoint of Iran's leadership, particularly Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Israel's actions were nothing short of a direct declaration of war, an existential threat to the regime's very survival. Iran's supreme leader and military council vowed to make Israel and its allies pay a heavy price. And almost immediately, Iran unleashed a barrage of missiles and drones towards Israel. Israel's anti-missile systems intercepted many, but not all. Some struck cities like Tel Aviv and Haifa, causing casualties and damage. Naturally, as the situation quickly escalated, all eyes around the world turned to the Strait of Hormuz. And sure enough, within a day of Israel's airstrikes, a key Iranian lawmaker raised the notion of Hormuz. In an interview with Iranian media, Esmail Kalsari said, "Closing the Strait of Hormuz is under consideration, and Iran will make the best decision with determination." Though he did not declare it would definitely happen, the mere acknowledgement that Iran's leadership was weighing that option sent shocks through every capital. Iran's military simultaneously launched large-scale naval exercises across the Gulf, a show of force that included live test firings of advanced anti-ship missiles and the rapid deployment of naval units into aggressive attack formations. Shipping in the region received emergency advisories. Some tank owners began rerouting or holding vessels outside the Gulf, not wanting to risk being caught in a potential shooting war at sea. Meanwhile, the United States, though insisting it had no part in Israel's strikes, quietly started shifting more military assets into the area. Additional warships, aircraft, and missile defense systems were rapidly deployed closer to the Gulf. What's concerning is that Washington is even moving an entire aircraft carrier strike group from the South China Sea. This move alone speaks volumes about the gravity of the situation. Aircraft carriers don't move around the world lightly, and by redirecting such a powerful asset away from the strategic competition with China, America is clearly warning Iran just how seriously it's taking the crisis, and how prepared it is to intervene if the situation spirals further out of control. Now, the real question for both you and I is, what would it actually look like if Iran decided to close the Strait of Hormuz? Well, like I mentioned earlier, the actual shipping lanes through Hormuz are extremely tight, confined to just 2 miles wide in each direction. On one side are Iran's territorial waters, and on the other side, Oman's. Under international law, specifically the rule known as transit passage, ships have a guaranteed right to pass freely through straits that are vital for global navigation, even through territorial waters. But international law only matters if everyone respects it. And in a moment of war, desperation, or what Iran might label as self-defense, Tehran could choose to completely ignore these laws. Tehran might physically block the passage, effectively shutting down commercial shipping overnight. In fact, from previous conflicts, we already have a clear idea of exactly how Iran could attempt to seal off Hormuz. And it's genuinely scary how prepared Tehran is for this exact scenario. Perhaps the simplest and most devastating tactic Iran could deploy immediately would be laying naval mines. Mines are cheap, passive weapons that can cause enormous damage, even sinking the largest tankers and ships for a few $1,000s. Iran could rapidly scatter hundreds of these naval mines, floating or anchored, directly into the tight shipping lanes. Just the threat alone would stop tanker traffic overnight. No captain would risk sailing a 300,000-ton supertanker through a minefield. We've already seen just how devastating these naval mines can be. Back in the 1980s, the USS Samuel B. Roberts hit an Iranian mine in the Persian Gulf, and the damage was catastrophic. It very nearly sank a fully equipped modern US Navy warship. But beyond just the explosions themselves, what makes these mines such a nightmare is how painfully difficult, slow, and risky it is to clear them after they're deployed. The US and its allies do have specialized mine-sweeping ships already stationed in the region, but clearing even a single mined strait can take days or even weeks, especially under active combat conditions. During that entire period, not a single commercial ship could safely pass through. And what's worse is that Iran almost certainly stockpiled a huge arsenal of these mines precisely for a scenario like this. Then comes the second threat, fleets of small but incredibly fast boats. Iran's IRGC Navy already operates fleets of speedboats that can swarm larger ships. Armed with rockets, heavy machine guns, and even explosives for suicidal attacks, these nimble boats can quickly weave between massive tankers and naval vessels, causing chaos within seconds. It's exactly the type of overwhelming scenario that the US Navy faced during the Millennium Challenge wargame back in 2002, and it ended disastrously. Even in real-life incidents over the last few years, the IRGC boats have repeatedly approached US warships at high speeds, not to attack outright, but to aggressively test their reactions and defenses. In a genuine war scenario, these speedboats could directly ram or bomb tankers, or even try boarding and hijacking them. Even if these swarms don't manage to sink a single tanker, their presence alone would be enough to terrify insurance companies and shipping operators, effectively shutting down Hormuz. Beyond mines and speedboats, Iran has also positioned an arsenal of powerful anti-ship missiles, aerial and naval drones, and even mini-submarines along its entire coastline. For example, missiles like the Chinese-designed Silkworm variants or Iran's own Noor and Qadr missiles can easily be truck-mounted, hidden discreetly among coastal cliffs, rocky coves, or isolated islands, and then fired accurately at ships moving dozens of miles offshore. During the 1980s tanker war, both Iran and Iraq used similar missiles to strike vessels in the Gulf. Today, though, Iran's missiles are vastly improved, far more accurate with greater range and significantly more destructive. Targeting a slow-moving tanker in the narrow strait would be dangerously easy. Just a few missile hits could ignite or even sink these massive vessels. And even the fear of being targeted, just the simple lock-on warning alarms, could easily scare tankers away from Hormuz. Additionally, Iran is becoming very effective in using unmanned drones. Recently, in both 2021 and 2023, explosive-laden Iranian drones struck oil tankers linked to Israeli interests in the Gulf of Oman. One of these strikes even killed crew members. These drones fly extremely low over the water, giving ships almost no warning before impact. Lastly, Iran's mini-submarines, particularly their Qadr-class midget subs, offer yet another deadly tool. These mini-submarines are specifically designed for shallow Gulf waters. They can approach shipping lanes, launch torpedoes, or even covertly lay mines without ever being detected until it's too late. Realistically, if Iran truly decides to shut down Hormuz, it would almost certainly use all of these methods simultaneously. But then again, it's not that easy. Any of the above actions would bring deadly consequences from all corners of the world, particularly the United States, the UK, and their allies, who've repeatedly made clear that keeping Hormuz open is absolutely non-negotiable. Which is exactly why, until today, Iran has always kept the closure of Hormuz purely as a threat, an ultimate final card deterrent they often warn about, but have never genuinely dared to attempt, at least not yet. Not only would Iran face catastrophic retaliation from outside if it tried closing Hormuz, but doing so would essentially mean Iran putting a bullet through its own head as well. You see, Iran itself relies on the Strait to export nearly all of its remaining oil and to import critical supplies, including essential food and medicine. It would also severely damage Tehran's few remaining diplomatic relationships, especially with countries like China. Remember, China currently imports over 75% of Iran's oil exports, effectively keeping Iran's economy afloat despite Western sanctions. If Iran shuts Hormuz and triggers a global economic meltdown that devastates China's economy, Beijing definitely won't be pleased. Iran risks losing one of its strongest diplomatic backers if it endangers China's energy security. This explains why Iran, even under extreme sanctions, never fully blocked the Strait in the past. But today's tensions have never been more unpredictable. If the supreme leader feels his own survival is threatened, he might decide there's simply nothing left to lose and play the ultimate Hormuz card. Sure, it seems like a reckless gamble, but when senior Iranian figures like Khosadi openly float this threat in public, you simply can't afford to rule it out. But what if Iran actually does it? What if they ignore all the risks, mine the Strait, attack tankers, and blockade shipping completely? Well, if that happens, the situation would immediately explode into an all-out international war. And like I said, the United States won't tolerate any attempt to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. This goes all the way back to the Carter Doctrine of 1980, when President Jimmy Carter explicitly warned that any hostile force trying to block the Persian Gulf would be treated as a direct assault on vital American interests and repelled by force if necessary. Every U.S. president since Carter has reaffirmed this stance, making it essentially an ironclad American commitment. Within minutes, the US and its allies would likely launch a massive military operation, designed specifically to crush Iran's capability to threaten shipping. American warplanes, taking off from aircraft carriers and air bases across the Gulf, would unleash devastating strikes on Iranian naval facilities, coastal missile launchers, Revolutionary Guard speedboat docks, radar sites, drone bases, and potentially even larger ports and infrastructure critical to Iran's war effort. Even NATO could become involved, especially if Iran's actions directly threaten or injure European military forces or vessels. For example, if an Iranian missile or mine hits a British or French warship, any attack that results in European casualties might trigger NATO's Article 5, bringing the entire alliance into military action alongside the United States. While Europe might initially want to stay out of the Israel-Iran conflict, a direct threat to global shipping and Europe's economy would absolutely force their hand. We'd probably see U.S. Navy destroyers, cruisers, and allied warships rapidly assembling escort convoys to move tankers safely through the Strait, prepared to directly engage Iranian boats, drones, submarines, or shore batteries that try to attack. A massive mine-sweeping operation would be launched to sweep the mines, likely a joint effort by US, British, and French mine-clearing units, possibly with support from other navies. Japan, for instance, has advanced minesweepers and might participate in protecting its oil flow. Through brute force, the Western coalition would aim to punch a hole in Iran's blockade and reopen the shipping lanes. But at the same time, Tehran could unleash a massive retaliation on multiple fronts by hitting US and allied forces' military bases across the Gulf. The United States alone has more than 30 military bases close to Iran, hosting tens of thousands of American troops spread across Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, and Oman, all well within range of Iran's extensive military arsenal. Tehran could also launch a massive barrage aiming directly at American assets like the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the largest U.S. air base in the region, or the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. And just like we've already seen happen to Israeli cities, even the most sophisticated missile defense systems can't stop every projectile, meaning inevitably some missiles would get through, causing serious damage and casualties. On top of that, remember that American troops in Iraq and Syria are already periodically attacked by rockets and drones from Iran-backed militias. Those assaults would immediately intensify dramatically, opening yet another chaotic front and possibly dragging American forces into deeper conflict in the region. Iran would also likely punish Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE by targeting vital infrastructure like oil refineries, depots, and export terminals. The goal would be to punish these nations for siding with the US and Israel, and further deepening the global economic shock by taking out additional oil production capacity. And, of course, Israel itself would find itself facing a furious storm unleashed by Iran's proxies. Hezbollah, the Iran-backed militia entrenched in Lebanon, has an arsenal of roughly 150,000 rockets and missiles. In support of Iran, Hezbollah would almost certainly open up a northern front, raining endless strikes into Israeli cities and towns. Israel could end up fighting a 2- or 3-front war against Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria simultaneously. The result could be the worst conflict Israel has faced in decades, with hundreds or thousands of missiles per day, requiring Israeli Air Force to divert from Iran and fight closer to home. At sea, the conflict could easily spread far beyond just the Strait of Hormuz. Iran could instruct its proxies, in particular Yemen's Houthi rebels, to attack or disrupt shipping routes around the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the mouth of the Red Sea. If Bab el-Mandeb becomes dangerous, Europe's critical alternative supply route through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal would also grind to a halt, further choking the continent's energy supplies. This could force European countries to reactivate Russian gas pipelines, despite heavy sanctions in place, just to keep their economies running. And let's not forget that Iran could also turn to terrorism or cyber attacks as additional ways to retaliate. For example, back in 2012, Iranian hackers hit Saudi Aramco with the devastating Shamoon virus, completely wiping out thousands of computers and bringing business operations to a halt for weeks. Sure, similar attacks today might not be as effective since Western cyber defenses have greatly improved, but the threat is still very real. Iran has also repeatedly shown it is willing to resort to targeted assassinations on foreign soil. For example, in 2011, U.S. prosecutors unsealed charges against Mansour Arbabsiar, a member of the IRGC Quds forces, for allegedly plotting to assassinate Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the United States by detonating a car bomb in Washington, D.C. Then, nearly a decade later, in 2022, U.S. officials revealed they'd foiled another assassination plot, this time targeting former National Security Advisor John Bolton and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, both planned as direct retaliation for America's killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. So you see how a single decision by Iran to block Hormuz could quickly escalate into a global war almost instantly. With that in mind, let's turn to China. Now, to be clear, Beijing isn't exactly friends with Iran, but it's definitely a crucial strategic partner, especially in terms of buying Iranian oil despite Western sanctions. But at the same time, China also maintains an extremely close tie to major Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Beijing imports even larger volumes of oil from them, making stable Middle Eastern supplies absolutely vital to its economic survival. That's why China is absolutely terrified of a major disruption in oil shipments. China's domestic oil resources aren't nearly enough to sustain its gigantic economy, and its strategic oil reserves could cover only a short disruption. Without Gulf oil, China faces a genuine nightmare scenario: industrial shutdowns, economic collapse, and domestic unrest. It's often said China's worst geopolitical nightmare is exactly this scenario: a Middle East oil crisis that cripples their economy. Given this reality, China would have a massive interest in quickly resolving or intervening in any conflict around Hormuz. Initially, Beijing would probably try diplomacy, as it successfully did in March of 2023 when it brokered the Saudi-Iranian Reconciliation Agreement. That was a huge diplomatic win for China and clearly showed their strong influence in the Middle East. But Israel is another story entirely. Israeli policymakers would be unlikely to budge or listen to diplomatic pressure from Beijing, especially when Israel's security and existence feels threatened by Iran's nuclear ambitions. So, if diplomacy fails and Iran actually moves forward aggressively by shutting Hormuz, China would find itself in a very difficult spot. Publicly, Beijing would almost certainly call for restraint, blaming the US for inflaming the crisis, and try to play the neutral peacemaker. Privately, though, China might strongly pressure Iran, urging Tehran not to push things further. But in a worst-case scenario, if the US Navy begins actively engaging Iranian forces, China would face a difficult choice. Does it stand aside and let Iran be taken out? Or does it take a more confrontational stance to secure its interests? Ultimately, the chances of Chinese and US forces directly facing each other in the Persian Gulf are extremely low. But it's not impossible. It would require an extraordinary scenario, like Iran desperately appealing to China and Russia for help in breaking the US-led blockade and establishing an international military presence to further deter Western aggression. Russia is already crippled in Ukraine, so Tehran's real hope in this scenario would rest almost entirely on China. Beijing might indeed step in, not out of loyalty to Iran, but purely to protect its own vital economic interests. In fact, China has spent years steadily expanding its navy and regularly deploys ships into the Indian Ocean and beyond. Just a few years ago, China even established its first major overseas naval base in Djibouti, strategically located in the Horn of Africa, not very far from the Persian Gulf itself. In an extreme situation, Beijing could deploy warships from Djibouti or dispatch a naval task force from home waters, specifically tasked with escorting Chinese-flagged oil tankers. This fleet could attempt to secure oil supplies from Iran itself. And if the US were attempting to enforce a maritime quarantine of Iran or secure the area, the presence of Chinese PLA Navy ships could lead to standoffs. Imagine an American warship stopping and inspecting a Chinese tanker, suspecting it's trying to break the blockade on Iran. Suddenly, a Chinese Navy destroyer could aggressively move between the US warship and the tanker, with weapons systems locked and crews anxiously exchanging warnings over the radio. This is exactly the type of tense scenario military strategists fear most. Even though neither the US nor China wants war, history repeatedly shows how quickly such standoffs can spiral out of control. All it takes is one misunderstanding, one poorly interpreted order, or even a single accidental shot, and suddenly the world's two strongest militaries are in direct, dangerous conflict. Washington would undoubtedly accuse Beijing of propping up Iran, especially if intelligence shows China covertly sending Iran weapons or economic relief. In return, Beijing would accuse Washington of destabilizing the region by siding with Israel and using military force. The two might also clash at the UN Security Council. China and Russia would almost certainly veto any resolution supporting US military action, and might also push their own resolutions urging restraint or condemning American intervention. This diplomatic face-off could quickly divide the world into opposing blocs, similar to the Cold War East versus West divisions, except this time it'll be over the Persian Gulf. From Russia's perspective, this kind of clash might even be strategically beneficial. Already isolated and at odds with the West over Ukraine, Russia would see an Iran-US conflict as an ideal distraction, pulling American attention and resources away from Europe and potentially pushing global oil and gas prices up higher, which directly benefits Moscow. Moreover, Russia might also ramp up military support for Iran, perhaps even openly delivering arms, equipment, and logistical support, since both nations are already heavily sanctioned and isolated anyway. The phrase World War III carries enormous weight, and is not something triggered lightly, but many experts and strategists genuinely worry that if multiple nuclear-armed powers face off directly, a single miscalculation could rapidly spark a global conflict. In a scenario like this, involving the Strait of Hormuz, we could realistically see multiple nuclear states, such as the US, China, Israel, and potentially even Russia, being drawn directly into a dangerous confrontation. But even if China doesn't directly intervene in a Hormuz conflict, that doesn't mean Beijing would quietly stand on the sidelines. In fact, Chinese leaders could see this global distraction as an extraordinary rare window of opportunity, one they've waited for decades for, to finally pursue one of the most fiercely guarded goals, retaking Taiwan. You see, China has clearly and consistently maintained that Taiwan is a non-negotiable part of its territory, repeatedly warning that reunification, by force if necessary, is inevitable. And over the past few years, China's military activity around Taiwan has surged dramatically. Fighter jets now routinely enter Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Warships regularly conduct provocative maneuvers around the island. And the People's Liberation Army has openly rehearsed amphibious invasions and blockade scenarios. One key factor that has held Beijing back is the fear of US military intervention. America not only sells advanced weapons to Taiwan, but also has a powerful Navy presence in the Pacific, especially aircraft carrier strike groups, which most experts believe has been the biggest factor stopping China from invading Taiwan. But now imagine if America suddenly finds itself deep in the Middle East crisis, forced to urgently send its critical military resources away from the Pacific towards Iran and the Persian Gulf. Even now, the United States is already moving one of its aircraft carriers, the USS Nimitz, out of the South China Sea and towards the Middle East. If things escalate, even more US military assets, such as guided missile destroyers, submarines, advanced fighters, and missile defense systems, could leave the Pacific. This would dramatically reduce the strength of America's military presence near Taiwan. With America's military stretched thin and distracted, Beijing could decide now's the time to finally launch the invasion or blockade that it's been preparing for. If it does, the effects would be immediate and catastrophic. Not just for Taiwan, but for the entire region, and indeed for the whole world. First, Taiwan is absolutely critical economically. It produces most of the world's advanced semiconductor chips, the tiny components that power computers, smartphones, military equipment, cars, basically everything. Losing access to Taiwan's chip industry would send shockwaves through the global economy, causing shortages and economic chaos around the world. Strategically, Taiwan sits at the very center of what America and its Asian allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines, call the First Island Chain. These islands act as a barrier containing China's military ambitions in the Pacific. If China successfully took Taiwan, it could quickly dominate the Western Pacific region, leaving US allies facing extremely tough choices. Either confront China directly or accept a new, dangerous reality with China as the regional superpower. And if that wasn't bad enough, other conflicts could erupt at the same time. For example, North Korea might see all this chaos as the perfect opportunity to provoke or attack South Korea, Japan, or even both. This could trigger multiple battles across several continents, drawing many countries into an increasingly dangerous spiral of conflict. Of course, this scenario is extremely speculative, but then again, not impossible. History has taught us repeatedly that once major global powers powers get distracted or bogged down in one crisis, other conflicts can suddenly erupt elsewhere, quickly spiraling into widespread and devastating wars. But let's be absolutely clear here. As of right now, at the exact moment of writing this script, Iran has not closed the Strait of Hormuz. Everything we've just explored is a worst-case scenario. It's a realistic, detailed look at how quickly and dangerously things could spiral out of control if that happened. A rabbit hole that shows the dangerous chain reactions that could occur. In reality, it's entirely possible that Tehran could step back, negotiate, and make some kind of deal with the US, allowing the Strait of Hormuz to remain open and functional as usual. And that might be the end of it.